So this week, in our reading, you may have noticed that Howard came in our Torah reader, varied the volume. We varied the volume because we were reading something called the Tochechot. The Tochechot is that section of the reading I had mentioned before, the horrifying section. The part that talks about the pit of horrible things that could happen. And there are different traditions about how we read that. We read it, it's in the Torah, and we have to read it. But we don't want to read it, we don't want to hear it. It's not a part of human history that we want to actually be reminded about. And so there are different traditions about how are we going to read this. And some communities read it really fast. They just boot it through really fast. Other shuls will read it very quietly in a whisper. If you'll notice, Howie lowered his voice so that it almost became difficult to hear him. Other shuls will read it right out loud. It is what it is. We face it. Other shuls will just read it slow. Other shuls will read portions of it. What we're talking about are traditions. We're looking at the different traditions that shuls create about how are we going to deal with this section of Torah that's a difficult section of Torah. No one is going to sit there and say, oh, yay, the Tochechot are coming. It's a difficult section, and we create traditions about how it is that we're going to read it. And when we look at Judaism, we know we have traditions for everything. We have law, we have traditions. It's not new. Since the very beginning of Judaism, we've had law, we've had traditions. And the Talmud, in fact, tells us in a number of different places. The first thing it tells us is traditions, minhag, which is the Hebrew word for tradition. Minhag, it says, the minhag of parents is Torah. And we get that in the Talmud, and we're thinking, oh, wow. So the weight of the tradition, the importance of the tradition, the Talmud just said, it's holy. It's like Torah. We get it from our parents. We inherit it from our parents. And we're trying to figure it out half the time because we're going to get traditions that we know we saw our parents doing, or we saw someone before us doing, and we know it's a family tradition, but we know that if we're asked why we do it, well, because my mother did it, because my grandfather did it, because my father did it, and it becomes the weight of the tradition, but we still try to figure them out. Where did they come from? They challenge us. So we inherit them, they are holy, they are Torah, says the Talmud, and we're still trying to figure them out. And then, in another part of the Talmud, it tells us that, in fact, traditions, the minhag, is in our hands. The minhag of our parents, it says, is in our hands. Well, you're telling me both things now. You're telling me on the one hand it has the weight of holiness and I take it on me the way I take Torah on me. On the other hand, you're telling me it was placed into my hands. If it's placed into my hands, it means now it's going to have my mark on it. Now I'm being told, personalize it. Don't just replicate and move traditions down. Add your mark. Add something that speaks of who you are. So now the inheritance of the tradition grows. And what gets passed to the next generation is more than what you got. I'm placing it in your hands. Do something with it. And so we look at these two statements, and we understand that we have the responsibility of inheritance and preservation. That's the tradition, that's that first statement the Talmud told us. But then at the same time, we understand that we have the responsibility of personalization. I need to figure out how I'm connecting to this tradition. How does it speak to me, and how do I then speak back to it? How does it now become something that grows in my hands? We move on, and then we know that there's something in Judaism that's called minhag hamakom, the tradition of the place. So when I said that we're of no lack of traditions, we've just sort of skimmed a surface here, and we're going to find it everywhere. There's the tradition of the place. There's the traditions we create in our home. And it's considered in Judaism, minhag hamakom, the tradition of the place. There are some homes we walk into, and it is their tradition that everybody should take their shoes off. There are some homes we walk into, and it is their tradition that don't take your shoes off. Other homes will have a tradition where there's slippers waiting by the door. Please take your shoes off, there's the slippers. You see it. It's the tradition in the home. We all do it, we all create it, and we all respect it in each other's homes. And then Judaism says, same thing in a synagogue, minhag hamakom. Synagogues create traditions. They become reflective of the people who created the synagogue. And so we've got a dynamic going on where we know what the Torah is telling us about building community and building holy spaces, and then we move through there to understanding, how now do I make it mine? And Judaism says you make it mine with the traditions, with the way they're going to speak back and forth, minhag hamakom. So what we should never do synagogue to synagogue is compete for holiness. We don't sit there and think, no, my shul's the holy shul. I don't know what you guys are doing. My shul's the holy shul. And by the way, that's in the Talmud as well, because there were the students of two great rabbis who used to argue about whose rabbi is holier. And the rabbis themselves shut it down. We don't have competitions for those kinds of things because we're supposed to personalize those kinds of things. So we meet our goal when it speaks to me and I speak back to it. And I don't expect that it's going to speak to the person who's going to another shul, because their responsibility is to mold theirs and to create theirs. It's minhag hamakom. We then end up with shuls that create footprints, and we understand those footprints. And when we walk into someone else's shul, we respect minhag hamakom. And if we look around and we see, oh, they're all doing X, then I respect that. I am a guest in their tradition, in their minhag hamakom. And it becomes the standard that we all accept. And now what happens is we add one more layer onto that, because the rabbis in the Talmud actually brought us another name for God that isn't used in the Torah. And the name they brought us is hamakom, which literally means the place. Minhag hamakom, the place. And part of that name says, if God is omnipresent, which we do believe to be true, God is everywhere, then there is no place that doesn't have a spark of God. So any place I name has the presence of God. Therefore, hamakom is a name for God, because God is everywhere. Except it's also what's used in minhag hamakom. So now we've entered a layer saying, God has traditions, divine traditions. Minhag hamakom. How do I find God's traditions? And for that, we actually have to go in between the lines of the Torah, in between the words of the Torah, to watch how God does what God does in repetitive form. There's the forming of a tradition. And God is infinite, so the list will never end. I will search God's traditions, and I will search deeper and deeper, and I will find them. And I need to respect them because, in fact, they're traditions. And then I come back full circle to what the rabbis told me at the very beginning. What did we say about traditions? They are Torah, and they are in our hands. So now, when I enter that level with all of the information that I brought with me, I understand that. I find the traditions of God. I must preserve, try to understand them, and then personalize them. They have to have my print on them as well. It's not a rock that I am encountering and just coming up on all the time, because that's not how tradition works. I inherit it, and then I personalize it. So if I notice God has created this divine tradition, I will inherit that, and then I have to ask myself, and where am I in that? How do I place myself in there? Where is my footprint? Where is my little contribution to that minhag? When we build memories of blessing that we know we do all the time, for those we've lost, for those we've missed, it's a relationship of dialogue. The relationship has changed. We know in Judaism that when souls weave, they don't unweave, they change. So now what we're talking about is that our memories keep us connected to people, whether they're here or not, doesn't matter. And the traditions they've left us keep them connected to us. And that becomes the dialogue that goes on all the time. Because I will do with that what I do with any inheritance. I inherit their traditions. I respect what I was given. I then try to understand where it came from so I'll understand more about them and I'll learn more about them. And then I'll personalize it in my own unique way. And now we've merged. We're always grateful for the richness that they continue to bring us because we continue to live within their traditions. Indeed, the traditions of those who came before us are the Torah that we all cherish today. So in fact, the sages were correct. And as we're going to continue and reach the conclusion of our Shabbat of Memory, as I'm concluding this sermon, to take a moment, again, feel free to close your eyes. Think of a tradition that you have and you didn't even know you had. A moment of connection through memory. A memory that brings a smile, a memory that brings a laugh, a memory that brings a warm feeling that can then find its way to a tradition that you personalize and speak of. So the relationship indeed does continue. The traditions become the Torah, and as the sages told us, they're placed in our hands. Shabbat Shalom.